Okay, howdy, welcome back. So we'll continue on. We talked about how user stories can essentially be used to introduce the features that we would like our users to be able to interact with or other stakeholders within our application um, to be able to do as they're executing that app. So we essentially introduced user stories, how they're kind of a lo-fi means of capturing this information that we can use them as we're going through the process of developing our apps to ensure that, okay, hey, we are implementing the features that we need to, as these cards or user stories can serve as more or less a list of requirements. And again, it's focusing on the overarching behaviors in terms of our application and not on the underlying implementation details. So user stories should be smart. They should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time boxed. When we refer to specific and measurable, each scenario should be testable. We should have some idea in terms of whether or not we've successfully implemented a particular feature. This would include both the happy paths, so ways that run as expected in terms of the overarching behavior of that feature, as well as the sad paths, which would be those that are include exceptional cases or areas where things might not go as expected. An example of something that is, both specific and then measurable in the sense that it would be, we'd be able to record it as actionable would be given some sort of starting conditions. So we're setting the stage. We have the environment set up that we'd like to interact with this system in. We then attempt to do something, say X, and then we should observe some sort of things to happen. And we can see here that this is both specific in the sense that the stage is set. The world prior to our action or interaction with it is adequately described. And then thereafter, how has the state of the world changed after we've invoked X, whatever X is? And we should be able to measure this as well. I mean, there should be some change that would occur when X has been done. So achievable, I'm going to keep this one short. We want to be able to implement it in a reasonable time fashion in order to stay on schedule. A lot of the MPs, we hopefully defined in a way that the features are achievable within the time frame for that MP. However, one consideration is when the final project comes around is do make sure that the user stories for your project are achievable within the time frame that we have. And again, not going into any software development cycles in specific here, but assuming that we're looking at maybe implementing one of these features per week. Let's just go ahead and use a week. We have 5 weeks. Make sure that you and your partner, are able to stay on that schedule. And if not, what we can see here is, well, maybe the user stories or features for your final project are too much of a stretch for the 5 weeks that we'll have at the end of the semester, or perhaps the way that you've organized them, they could be broken up into smaller components. Relevant. So again, we're kind of in an academic environment here. In the real world, we'd want to be implementing features that essentially produce some sort of business value for the end user. Protect revenue, increase revenue, manage costs, increase brand value, making the project remarkable, providing more values to customers, etc. In this course, I mean, if you start thinking about features maybe you're implementing for the MPs, well, hopefully you're not adding in any extra and outrageous features. I mean, it's totally okay to go above and beyond, but do ensure that the features that you are implementing are relevant. And then perhaps once you have the relevant stories, you can begin thinking about ways to add more value to the application if you so desire. But I mean, first and foremost, you do want to ensure that where you're spending time will pay off in some way, shape, or form. For the MPs, that's implementing what's necessary to get the grade that you hope to achieve. Out there in the business world, it will be essentially, you're going to want to have features that are relevant and help the person employing you to have a return on their investment in in the software that they've had you create. Timeboxed. So you kind of need to know when to stop. So if you're looking at a user story and you're expending a lot of time and personnel hours onto it, perhaps it's time to stop that story for the meantime. Maybe divide it up into smaller stories or reschedule what is left undone. For instance, okay, you're going about, I don't, just so a lot of these slides are taken from my software engineering course, which was focused on interaction with clients. Well, how do we do in this introductory programming course when we're thinking about, we're building these, completing these MPs, I guess, for learning, but also a grade at the end of the day, right? So maybe you have this list of features and you're going, okay, I need to implement 5 of them to be on to be able to turn in my MP on time. And let's say you're really struggling with one of the features. So maybe you need to break that up into more decomposable parts, focus on different areas and kind of incrementally develop it. Or maybe you need to reschedule that feature for later and focus on things that you are able to get done in the meantime. Obviously, we don't want to say ignore that feature, but we do want to ensure that we're making forward progress to the end goal, whatever that may be. So, you know, realizing you're hitting a brick wall and maybe it's time to go get help during office hours, perhaps it's time to focus on another aspect, the implementation of another feature of your program. All of these, it's important to recognize these and react accordingly. So again, this is kind of thinking about it from a software engineering group perspective, but how do we measure productivity in terms of what we're developing? And this might be helpful for, say, the final project when you're working in small teams, or maybe any sort of small project that you're working on through our curriculum is think about, well, how productive are we? Are we on track? Are we not? Well, a measure of team productivity could be the average number of user stories per week. But what we have to keep in mind is not all features that we're looking to include into our programs or applications are necessarily of the same complexity. So it's important to rate user stories in advance on some sort of scale. Simple integer scale would work well for our application. You'd have 1 for a straightforward feature, 2 for medium, 3 for very complex. If you get into very like super complex user stories, again, that's probably a good indication that they need to be split up into multiple smaller, more manageable user stories. And then how we can measure our productivity is going to be simply the average number of points that we're completing per week. And, at this point, you might be going, okay, well, I'm just going to assign a, massive point value to some of these and begin looking super productive to whoever I'm sharing my velocity measures with. Well, this is more of kind of a measurement that should be used internally opposed to externally. So the key idea here is it doesn't matter if velocity is 5 to 10 points per iteration. And by iteration, I'm simply saying, let's say it's 1 week. So 1 week we come back as a group and we evaluate how we're doing. Are we progressing towards the end goal? Not. What are the hiccups, etc. What we want to do is gather a measure of velocity such that we're able to better predict how productive we can be per week. If we are rating our user stories consistently and I don't want to say honorably, but in a manner that would communicate honestly, I think is what I'm going for. If we're ranking or assigning point values that are honest in terms of what we think it would take to implement that particular feature, over time, what we'd see is some sort of measure of velocity that would be a good indicator in terms of our throughput or our output that could be expected within 1 week of time. The idea is to improve self-evaluation and suggest a number of, say, iterations for a particular feature user story as well. So if we're only able to do 5, a small number of points per week, and we have some complex features, perhaps we, schedule things accordingly and see the best way to ensure that we're able to arrive at the conclusion of the project on time. Okay, so we went over kind of some of the importance of these user stories, also came up with a single measure of productivity. I will say I'm not going to, on an exam, ask you to calculate velocity. Maybe we'll have you write a couple of user stories derived, from some broad descriptions of a project. But at the end of the day, we should really be using these as a tool to help you towards the completion of an MP, and then also to ensure that you're able to implement your say final project in a manner where the features and what you're interested in completing are quite clear up front before you begin working on this. And again, you can always add user stories later on throughout this process as warranted.